I want to live a life where I understood that tomorrow wasn't promised, so let me live today. Let me live in the now. Let me be present. Every time there's breath in your lungs, you have to understand it was God that woke you up that morning. And if God has woke you up this morning, it means today has purpose. Your life has meaning. Don't ever lose sight of it. The two most important days of your life are the day you were born and the day you find out.
According to the New York Times, black kids' suicide rates are high and increasing. Research shows that suicide rates among black girls increased by an average of 6.6% each year. Now, it was once said by medical experts, assuming that people of all races had the same risk factors for self-harm. Emerging evidence suggests that is not the case. See, Joe was 17 when he decided life wasn't worth living. The violence in his Boston neighborhood was becoming a burden on his mental health. His older brother had spent more than a year recovering from a gunshot wound to his leg. And at the time, in school, Joe was especially tired of comments about his weight. Abusive words like, "You think you could sit on that chair?" his classmates would ask. Other times his classmates would be more direct, saying simply, "You're fat," which led him sometimes being so depressed he wouldn't eat for 3 days. He was a lineman on the high school football team, just thinking to himself thoughts about ending his life if the bullying continued. Those same thoughts he had eventually became so pervasive that one day he came home from school and took a small handful of pills. Thank God at the time it was only enough to produce a bad stomachache. Months later, still feeling depressed, he asked his father, "Let me go see a therapist. My head's not right. I'm having these thoughts of killing myself." They're saying that they'll all be better without him there. Joe's father's response was, "That's not true. We love you. But you want to talk to someone and tell them something like that? They're gonna think you're crazy." Over the past generation, a mental health crisis has been brewing among black youths like Joe, one that very few people, including black families, have spoken about publicly. Self-reported suicide attempts rose nearly 80% among black adolescents from 1991 to 2019. While the prevalence of attempts did not change significantly, legislators and academics are now pushing for better research to understand why, especially in light of new evidence that suggests black children may have a unique risk factors for self-harm. One study of high school students published in September found that black teenagers surveyed were more likely than the white teenagers to have attempted suicide without first having suicidal thoughts or plans, because suicide screening questionnaires typically ask whether people are having suicidal thoughts or have made plans to hurt themselves. The authors speculated that the questionnaires might fail to identify some black youths who are at risk of suicide, or that there could be additional factors that might indicate a need for intervention. More research is needed, but a government study conducted last year suggested that black children and adolescents who died by suicide were more likely than white youths to have experienced a crisis in 2 weeks before they died. They were also more likely to have had a family relationship problem, argument, or conflict, or a history of suicide attempts. Jordan Burnham, who survived a jump from a 9th-story window when he was 18, said that if he had been asked whether he was planning to kill himself that day, the answer would have been no. "I couldn't even think far ahead," he said. The fall broke his pelvis, shattered his left leg, and fractured his wrist, skull, and jaw. It would be 4 years before he could walk again. He didn't necessarily want to die. He was 32 and visits as many as 60 schools a year to speak about suicide prevention and mental illness. But the part of him that had depression and shame and sadness every day, he wanted that pain to die. He wanted that part of it to go away. Now, on the day of his suicide attempt, he was confronted by his parents about a stash of alcohol that they had found in his car. Although Mr. Burnham was diagnosed with depression as a teenager, he became so good at hiding it that even his own family members, who were loving and supportive, did not fully understand how much pain he held inside, or the extent to which he felt like an outsider as one of the few black students at a mostly white school in suburban Philadelphia. You see, suicide and mental illness are often thought of as a white phenomenon, said Michael A. Lindesey, the executive director of McSilver Institute of Poverty Policy and Research at New York University, who studies the mental health of black adolescents. Looking at the raw numbers, he says it's easy to understand why white deaths by suicide far outnumber those of black people. But when taken into account youth suicide rates, the number of suicides per 100,000 individuals under age 25, a different picture emerges. He thinks the statistics are shocking. Dr. Lindsay, who was the first to document trends in rising suicide attempts among black adolescents. A 2018 study found that while the suicide rate of black children 5 to 12 was low, it was nearly twice that of white children in the same age group. In one of the most recent examples, a 10-year-old black girl, autism, died by suicide in Utah in early November. Her parents said she had been subjected to the racist bullying by her classmates. Among teenagers and young adults, suicide rates remain highest among whites, Native Americans, and Alaska Natives. But while the suicide rate has recently declined among those groups, it has continued to rise among black youths. From 2013 to 2019, the suicide rate of black boys and men 15 to 24 years old rose by 47% and by 59% for black girls and women of the same age. Adolescents of color who identify as LGBTQ may be especially at risk of suicide attempt, according to the national survey conducted by Trevor Project, a suicide prevention group for the LGBTQ youth. Despite the racial disparities and the fact that suicide is the second leading cause of death among all adolescents, there has been an in-depth research examining the racial and ethnic differences in youth suicidal ideation plans or suicide attempts. And this is partly because black researchers who examine health disparities have been underfunded. In March, the director of National Institutes of Health issued a public apology for structural racism biomedical research, but also because there are only a handful of academics who study these topics. You have to bring culture into this. You have to talk about racism. You have to talk about discrimination, said Ariel Sheftal, a principal investigator at Center for Suicide Prevention and Research at Nationwide Children's Hospital in Columbus, Ohio. It is something that black youth experience every single day. A report presented to Congress in 2019 identified gaps in research and policy and has resulted in more research dollars flowing to studies related to black youth suicide, including a program to teach middle schoolers about mental health and suicide prevention intervention called Success Over Stress, which touches on themes like systemic racism and police brutality to help ninth grade students at predominantly black schools develop coping skills.